Back in 2010, the Seahawks were not very good. They went 7-9. They were 27th in yards allowed on defense, 25th in points allowed, and despite the fact that they did win a playoff game that year, they were still one of the worst teams in the league. That being said, the defense had a coaching staff that included 4 guys with very prominent roles in the NFL today. That includes Ken Norton, the linebackers coach, who's now the defensive coordinator of the Raiders, Chris Richard, the secondary coach, who is now the defensive coordinator of the Seahawks, Gus Bradley, the defensive coordinator at the time. He is now going into his 3rd and possibly final year of the Jacksonville Jaguars head coach, and Dan Quinn, the defensive line coach, who took over for Gus Bradley as the defensive coordinator in Seattle and is now going into his 1st year as the head coach of the Atlanta Falcons and is hoping to have a much more successful run than what Bradley's been doing in Jacksonville. Also hoping that that happens is Dave Choate of the Falcoholic, who is joining us on the Real in the Field Goal podcast today. Dave, how are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on. And a guest co-host today, Danny Kelly, could not make it. Send your letters to Comcast, RE that situation. And filling in for him is Mina Kimes of ESPN, the magazine. Mina, how are you?
Good. Good to be here.
Mina, can you explain the difference between a magazine and ESPN, the channel?
There really is no difference. I work for the magazine. I write a column that appears in every issue, but they also run on ESPN.com, ESPN everything. So.
Hey, that's good. Dave, you've had Dan Quinn for a couple months now. What are your first impressions as far as what you've heard him say, what you've seen him do in terms of rebuilding the Falcons after, 5 or 6 years of Mike Smith?
7 years. 7 years of Mike Smith. Yeah. My first impression of Quinn was a great one. I think, a lot of people had a lot of good things to say about him. He's a fired-up kind of guy. He says that on Twitter an awful lot. But, this is a guy that I think is the perfect man to take over for Mike Smith, who was very even-keeled, very stay-the-course, and that's something that worked well for a long time. But now you're looking at a Falcons team that's kind of in shambles, really needs a different presence, a different kind of coach. And Quinn's really taken over and I think put his stamp on the team and on the roster early here. And, not everyone's happy with some of the moves that have been made. Not everyone's happy with the lack of a big free agent splash. But, Quinn has made a really good first impression, I think, on most people in Atlanta. And once we actually get to see what the team can do on the field, I'm hoping that'll continue.
Yeah. Mina, what do you think that he's going to be getting out of Dan Quinn after what you saw the last 2 years of him coaching the Seahawks defense?
Yeah, when the Jets were looking like a contender for Quinn, I put together a big DQ primer for my friend. And the first thing I sent him was the town hall video. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
So, it was really the first time you really saw him give an extensive sort of talk about his philosophy, which really centers around, going after the quarterback and his tough physical. And I was just kind of blown away by his charisma. You almost want to vote for him for president after watching that. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe we only have 1 more year of this guy. I think the biggest question mark, and this is what I put in my email to my friend with Dan, is how much of what's happened with the defense can be attributed to him. Pete Carroll is a defensive coach. So you really have to break down some of the moves that happen, especially along the D-line, the development, bring in free agents, and try to, gauge how much of that he played a role in.
Right, and it's interesting just how much we do judge a new head coach based on the success of a unit that he was with prior to that, but really how much of being a head coach really matters in terms of what they were doing in terms of X's and O's, as opposed to a guy like Pete Carroll who really probably does know a lot about X's and O's, but really it's the presence of him as sort of a leader, I think, also that matters so much. And Dan Quinn does seem like a leader, doesn't he?
Yeah, and I think that, Dave alluded to the lack of splashy free agent signings, which we'll get to, but watching what he's done with that defense on free with Atlanta so far, going to a lot of sort of low-priced bets, getting some prove-it deals. That's very in line with what happened in the offseason for Seattle over the last few years.
Yeah, and Dave, he hired Kyle Shanahan as his offensive coordinator, a guy that I don't know how much, speaking of like how much people want to be attributed to certain successes, here's a guy that had followed his father around for a long time, and then last year was with the Cleveland Browns and was sort of had an odd exit there where he asked to leave. Are you excited about Kyle Shanahan? Does it give you more hope than, say, Dirk Cutter?
He gives me more hope, primarily, and again, this is sort of the theme of the offseason for Atlanta, but because he's different. Dirk Cutter was good at some things, very good at some things. I think he opened up the passing attack in a way that made the 2012 season possible, but at the same time, this team hasn't been able to run since Michael Turner still had his legs under him back in 2010, 2011. So you look at him now, and Kyle Shanahan is going to come in. He's going to install very familiar zone blocking principles. I think that's going to help Devonta Freeman, who's in his second year, young guy. And I think Shanahan's a little bit more creative. He's going to get 2 tight ends involved. He's going to do a little bit more with a gadget player like Antone Smith, who I think was underused for years in Atlanta. So looking at it, yeah, I'm excited to see what he can do. I'm just hopeful that the line's going to hold up and that, the passing game doesn't suffer for him. But he's also never had a quarterback, I think, of the caliber of Matt Ryan.
Yeah, a few people really have, and that's what it seemed like. Dan Quinn had his choice when he was out there. There were a handful of open jobs, and the only one that had a quarterback that really made you feel good was the Atlanta Falcons. So it seemed like it was the best job available, because any coach will tell you that his job gets a lot easier and a lot safer when he has a quarterback. Some people would say, it's Mike Smith and Matt Ryan came in at the same time, and maybe Matt Ryan kept Mike Smith around for longer than another quarterback would have done. Mina, how do you feel watching the Atlanta Falcons over the last couple of years, sort of their collapse despite having Matt Ryan, Julio Jones, Roddy White, some exciting players?
Right. So since when was the day that they knocked us out? February. Tony Gonzalez smashing down the field, Pete icing our own kicker. What day was that?
That was about January 11th or January 12th. I know because that was the day that I quit smoking. So that was the last. That was the day that was so bad that I quit smoking that day. So it was, and they've really changed a lot.
Until this last Super Bowl, that was probably one of the most brutal losses I've experienced as a Seahawks fan, I have to say. Just how it went down,
Yeah, I actually think that the Super Bowl loss this year wasn't brutal to me because of the Falcons loss. I felt like after the Falcons loss, I felt like this has to be my baseline for how low I'll go emotionally from a loss. And then, so basically ever since then, I've sort of, I've kept an even keel, win or lose, which, has its positives and negatives. But, yeah, I suppose since then the Falcons have only won 10 games, which is surprising. Dave, what do you think, what was the biggest difference over the last 2 years? Just terrible defense?
Yeah, I think, terrible defense. You look at the offensive line, and I know you guys are familiar with this, but, this is a team that just kept losing starters again and again and again, and was forced to, this last year, undrafted free agent center James Stone, who actually played pretty well, but here's a third-string center, and we were wondering why they kept 3. Well, Joe Hawley, the starter, got hurt. Peter Kahns, his backup, got hurt shortly thereafter, and this is the guy you're starting the rest of the season. So, you take a poor defense, you take some coaching blunders. People like to point out that Mike Smith did not have the best time management skills, and I don't know too many head coaches that do, but it's definitely true. And you just take all of that, you take a few bad free agency draft periods, and it just all kind of came together the last 2 years. And, it's tough to know exactly who to blame, but the Falcons pretty handily scapegoated, I think, Mike Smith for that. So hopefully they were right to do so.
Yeah, it would, only time will tell. About some of these, we alluded to it earlier, but about some of these free agent additions, it doesn't inspire a whole lot of confidence in terms of change year over year. Leonard Hankerson, Jacob Tammy, Justin Durant, Brooks Reed, Phillip Adams, Adrian Claiborne, O'Brien Schofield, and just recently now, Tony Moyaki. So you got a couple of Dan Quinn guys, not guys straight up, but guys that he worked with in Seattle last year. Is that
We also
sort of you
tight
think
end, right?
anything? Which
From
one?
the Broncos. Trying to remember.
Tammy? Yeah.
Right, so
So
that's
that
right.
it was that was a big that's a big difference as well, was the fact that there was no replacement for Tony Gonzalez except for Levine Toilolo, who is never going to be a
So
fraction of Tony Gonzalez.
yeah.
So what do you think so far about those moves, Dave?
We kind of participated in that tradition, assigning grades way too early, and there were two more signings after we did it this morning, but I slotted in around a B minus, and I think, I look at this team and I look at how badly they needed help at some of these positions. They had nothing at linebacker last year, and that's putting it charitably. These have all been, to me, moves that have improved the team, and it might be incremental, and in some cases it's just going from incompetent to competent. But it's been so long now since the Falcons have had a defense that I felt good about, or even a little bit confident in, to rush the passer, to cover, to prevent long third downs. That's been a really huge Achilles heel for this team for years. So, I look at it and they've got a lot of work to do. They're going to have to do a lot of it through the draft, unfortunately, but this is a team that I feel better about than I did last year. And I think, for me, that's a start.
Part of the reason that I think you could probably feel a little bit better is, who knows what's going to happen with the division next year. The Panthers, the Saints, the Saints have dismantled themselves a little bit. The Panthers, weren't very good last year. They managed to win the division, but, and they came on at the end. And then the Bucks, obviously, perhaps the worst team in the league, and we'll see what happens as far as whether or not they get a quarterback next year. Mina, do you see the Falcons possibly, Dave, getting a playoff game again next year?
Yeah, the teams you just mentioned, in the division, I didn't think any of them got significantly better through free agency either this offseason. So, it seems like it'll still be competitive, or at least relatively competitive. And I like some of the players you guys signed. I don't know. I mean, I like the deals. I was just kind of pulling them up now. And there are a lot of, pretty cheap bargains. I mean, I really like Adrian Claiborne, who was great as a rookie, and that's a great deal, a year for $4.5 million. I guess Reed looks a little expensive, but it seems like, a pretty solid round of signing to me. Again, nothing flashy, but
you get Hankerson in, but Harry Douglas goes out. I don't know exactly who is. I mean, I realize Steven Jackson was at the end of the career, but I don't know who the running back is going to be now. What exactly do you think is the plan at running back, or is it going to be more of let Julio Jones and Roddy White and Matt Ryan move the ball?
Well, passing game is going to be critical, but I think that they've got a kid in Devonta Freeman that I feel pretty good about. I don't know if he's ever going to be a great back, but I think he's a good one already. I think he catches the ball well out of the backfield. I think he's a decisive runner. He's got pretty good vision. And he's got, he had a little bit of problems with blocking and ball security last year, but I still think he's going to be in pretty good shape. I think they'll probably draft a rookie. I'm hoping for somebody like David Cobb in the 4th round, if that's a possibility. But, it's going to be a complementary running game more than anything else, but I feel pretty good about it. And we've seen, zone blocking teams turn some of these just okay to good backs into pretty damn good ones for a long time. So,
Dave, who do you think what positional groups do you think they're going to target in the early rounds? Given how high you guys are picking, you could go after one of the really athletic pass rushers, maybe a Vic Beasley, or do you think they'll bolster the line?
I think it's got to be somebody like Beasley. I think, this team hasn't had a great pass. He's so good. He's my guy, definitely.
I'm a little so hard.
Oh yeah, I just, I'm concerned he's not going to make it to number 8, and he might not. But somebody like that is the prototype guy I think that Dan Quinn's going to be looking for. I have my hopes that if Beasley doesn't make it there, somebody like Randy Gregory slips down a little bit, but they need a pass rusher very, very badly. They've been lacking that since they had John Abraham, and in the entire time that John Abraham was in Atlanta, they never really had a complimentary guy for him. So you add somebody like Claiborne, you add O'Brien Schofield, you're hoping that a Croy Bierman, a Brooks Reed can help out a little bit with the pass rush, and then you add a talent like Vic Beasley, and I think that goes a long way toward fixing that front seven. So that's, I think it's pretty much pass rusher or bust unless the draft shakes out in a way that's not possible.
Yeah, I was pretty blown away just looking at the stats today. You can't catch everything, and I'm just sort of blown away by the fact of how not good the pass rush was in Atlanta. The leading sack getter was Croy Bierman with 4.5. That was the most sacks on the Falcons. Nobody else had more than 2.5. And I feel like you could play a game called, is this a linebacker for the Falcons, or is this a character in the new Star Wars movie? You guys got Joplo Bartow.
Yep.
Prince Shembo.
Yep.
Paul Warlow. Croy Bierman. It's an interesting little thing to do, but there was one pass rusher available for just about anyone. Ended up signing with the Dallas Cowboys, and I think we know his name is Greg Hardy. Now, if Greg Hardy goes on the Falcons, they could have afforded him. They could have plugged him. They could have. Basically, you have one guy that's as talented as a pass rusher as that. He can change the ability for the whole rest of the team to be able to get to the quarterback. Dave, did you ever think that signing Greg Hardy would be a good idea?
No, not really. And, I say that as somebody who, when Greg Hardy was coming out of college, I was pushing really hard for him to be drafted, especially the further he slipped down into the draft. But, the Falcons have kind of a long-standing thing under Thomas Dimitroff that they don't take, huge risks on guys with character concerns. And I think, fair or not, and I think it's perfectly fair, given that it's a domestic violence issue, given what, happened in particular here, this is a guy who I don't think was ever going to get a chance with the Falcons. And, he's clearly talented, but the way the Cowboys structured his deal tells you everything you need to know about how confident everybody's feeling about him, his particular character, and whether he's going to do something like this again. And I don't claim to know anything about that, of course. But at the same time, this is not a great fit for the Falcons, I think. They're trying to rebuild their whole team piece by piece, upgrade at every spot. You take somebody like Hardy, he helps for 1 year, assuming he's not suspended for a while. But then you've got to re-sign him the next year. If, he keeps his nose clean, he plays in every game, he's costing you $13 million this year, and then you've got to sign him back or let him go to another team that's going to give him a huge contract. And I think even with Greg Hardy, the Falcons are not probably going to be a Super Bowl contender this year, so it's not a gamble that I thought they should take, and it wasn't a gamble I expected them to take.
Yeah, Mina, what are your thoughts have been? There were rumors, obviously, for a minute that the Seahawks were going to have a visit with him, and then they said, no, we're just doing our due diligence. So what were your feelings in the moments when you thought it might happen?
You and I talked about this or G-chatting the other day. I think before the rumors really heated up around the Seahawks, would you want him? And, I said no. Partially because I felt like a team like the Seahawks, as a fan, aside from my own moral compunction, about it, as a fan, the amount of crap we got about the PED stuff back in 2013, was so freaking annoying. And in this case, they would be absolutely right to give us crap. And so thinking through that and what my fan experience would be like, and the fact that I didn't think the team needed him. I thought it would be extremely additive, but I don't know. I didn't want it to happen. I was really nervous. I was tracking it really carefully. And also, we should talk about the fact that he's going to be suspended probably for a pretty long time.
Right.
So I didn't think it made sense for the Seahawks either. That's still going to play out, but I think it could be anywhere from maybe 4 to 6 games.
Now, he was suspended by the team last year only after the Ray Rice video came out. And he missed 15 games, but he was paid his full salary of over $13 million.
He's on the commit exempt list, which is like purgatory.
Right. So, do you have any? You said he could get suspended for 4 to 6 games. Do you think after a pay suspension he should get much more than that?
It's complicated. So, Ray Rice and Adrian Peterson received very long suspensions and were successfully able to appeal that because their sort of violations occurred before the league instituted the new policy, which is, I think, 1 strike, 6 games, 2nd strike, you're out, right? So they were applying the new policy, according to their appeal, which succeeded, the league was applying the new policy to past violations. And I think the same thing would happen with Hardy. So the league will, the league is taking a very hard look at the case. I think they've just asked for all the documents and everything. By every indication, they're going to suspend him, and it's going to be that old Roger Goodell style of whatever I feel like. So it could be a Roethlisbergerian 6 games. It could be anything.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up Ben Roethlisberger, just like we could bring up a whole litany of players, just because, as I wrote on Sports on Earth this week after the Cowboys had signed Greg Hardy, and I think the people they can pass their judgments on the Cowboys, or I feel like everybody has the right to their opinion, but as far as what the Cowboys do, and there's feelings and then there's actions, and what people can do is if they disagree with the thing, they can just not participate in watching any Cowboys games or whatever. But as history has shown us, it seems like a lot of times these moments fade, especially when the player is successful, that we forget, or we choose to ignore their past transgressions. You can look at, how many people said Michael Vick's career was over, and then I remember in 2010 with the Eagles, the guy was the most popular player in the NFL. He is doing everything out there, and people were just, you had the people that said, that they hated him and they would protest, but, it's interesting to see exactly what's going to happen with Greg Hardy after if he gets 15 sacks or something like that. What exactly is going to happen? Dave, do you think that the Cowboys made a right decision?
I think from a, purely football on the field perspective, and that's really what people would rather you stuck to talking about, they made the right decision. But from almost any other perspective, I think you can definitely dispute that. And the way I look at it is, people really only care about things to the extent that they're directly affected by it. And so what you see again and again, and I certainly saw this from the Falcons fan base, folks would downplay the Greg Hardy case, try to say, well, there wasn't a settlement, or he wasn't, basically splicing wherever they could to say the Falcons should sign Greg Hardy. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right. I think something like this fades. If Hardy's successful a year from now, nobody's going to have any qualms about, driving up his price and treating him like any other free agent. Mm-hmm. It's sort of become more of a public relations thing, something like this, than a morality thing. And I think that's kind of unfortunate in a way. I do think that, there's something to everybody deserving a second chance, but I don't think it necessarily has to be with your team. So, I think you can certainly make the case that the Cowboys did make the right decision here. It'll make their team better, more than likely, unless he somehow earns a whole season suspension. But it's not something I feel great about, I guess.
Yeah, and we usually, we don't necessarily need to. We don't usually stick around too hard on the sensitive topics on the podcast, but it is a worthy conversation to have, I think. Mina, did you want to add anything else about this situation?
No, I mean, I think, it's just as he was talking about the Falcons and sort of the culture that their GMs instituted. In recent years, we haven't had too many cases with Hawks players where you kind of had that cognitive dissonance between being a fan. All the players that have issues have been marginal, cut. You haven't had a really talented player who's also done things off the field that made you question whether you should be cheering for him. I mean, I think the last player that I really felt that way about was, I don't know, Jeremy Stevens. So it certainly makes our lives easier as fans when we don't have to question why we're cheering for these guys.
Well, I will say, the one of the interesting things about the Greg Hardy situation, probably what makes it so interesting is the fact that, it happened, and then it was not like it was a big story, I'm sure, in Carolina, but I don't really remember. Even as someone that pays attention to the NFL all day, every day, it wasn't to me like a thing. Even though this was a guy coming off of a 15-sack season or whatever, like to me it was like, oh, so a guy's in trouble, blah blah blah, and then the Ray Rice video comes out, and it really does change the culture of how we perceive all of the players, and especially when it involves, a domestic violence situation or a violent situation, that even after, say like Aaron Hernandez's situation where he's charged with murdering 3 people, like because he wasn't given the opportunity to play football again, we don't have to debate whether or not he should. So it's like now that we have Greg Hardy as a guy that is in the prime of his career, is 26 years old, would normally be worth $70, $80 million contract. We know that he was convicted, found guilty by a judge last year, and then we also know that, that even if it was thrown out, pretty much everyone assumes, and whether it's right or wrong, that he's guilty, so that we actually have to face the fact that if our team signs him, that we know what we're facing. But at the same time, I can name 2 Seahawks that have domestic violence charges, whether they were convicted or agreed to a settlement, and one of them is on the team right now. The other one was just on the team last year. They were both starters. They also signed Parrish Cox for a couple games. Like we didn't have to face those because that was like the pre-Ray Rice, and now we're in the post-Ray Rice.
I think if the allegations against Greg Hardy are choking and dragging, if there was video of that, assuming if it happened and there was video or photos, they wouldn't have signed him. We wouldn't be having this conversation. Is my, speculation, but that's how I feel.
Yeah, I would agree that when you actually have to, like, Ray Rice, if there wasn't a video, he obviously would have played almost all of last season.
None of this would have happened if there wasn't video. We wouldn't be having this conversation right now about domestic violence, about these players. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, even Adrian Peterson being in a situation, a different type of domestic situation, it wouldn't have, all of that stuff changed because of the video. So, that when we do have to face it, it does sort of change the dynamic of everything. Moving on, Dave, you did talk about your poor offensive line play. I kind of want to talk about Jake Matthews. This is your situation where you really did want to improve either the offensive line or the pass rush. Who knows if you guys would have taken Khalil Mack. He went one ahead of you. He might be turning into the best linebacker in the NFL. He definitely had a great season. You passed on Anthony Barr. He had a pretty good season. There's different ways to judge that. Maybe he didn't. I think Taylor Lewan of the Tennessee Titans had a really good season as a left tackle for the Titans. And you guys took Jake Matthews, who all of his grades seem to be pretty poor. So what do you think so far of Jake Matthews and his future?
I think he's still got a very bright future. This is a guy who suffered some injuries early in the season that I think really hampered him the rest of the way. And, some people would call that excuse making, but, it's kind of the reality that when you're trained to be the right tackle, you're thrust into action because Sam Baker, who was expected to be the starter on the left side, is injured, during Hard Knocks, no less. That's a tough role to step into. I think the whole thing about, rookie tackles being the safest pick has always been overblown. There's not a lot to that. And I think that Matthews still has everything you look for in a prototype left tackle, but he really did not play well his rookie season. And I do think injuries were a contributing factor. I do think the effectiveness of the rest of the line was a factor, but he didn't hold up very well. And I think that it's going to be really critical for the Falcons to figure out this year if he can be that guy, if they need to move him to the right side, and if they do need to move him to the right side, do they have any options on the roster right now to take over on the left? And I think that that's very much up in the air. So this is a big year for Matthews. I don't think he's going to be a top 10 tackler in the league or anything, but I expect him to get at least close to a league average left tackle.
What is the situation with Sam Baker?
It's a tough situation. They signed him to a big contract, and he has missed each of the last 2 seasons, essentially, with injuries. He's a guy that's never been terribly durable. He's had back problems throughout his career, and he's never really been more than a slightly above average starter at any point in his career. So, if I'm the Falcons, I'm not relying on him to do much of anything. They've got another young guy, an undrafted guy, Ryan Schrader, on the right side that I think did a good job last year, deserves another shot. I think you almost just have to take the huge cap hit with Baker, let him compete for a job, but if he's nothing more than a backup tackle, then you take that this year, you hope he's healthy, he provides good depth, and you look to move on from him next year.
Dave,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, how do you feel about the pass defense next year? We know about little Trufant, but do you see them going at it being awesome, but do you see them going after a safety in the draft? What can they do to sort of take that to the next level?
Yeah, it's a tough question because Trufant's so good. William Moore, when he's healthy, is a very good strong safety. And Robert Alford, who should be the number 2 corner, is a guy who's really, really aggressive, big-time ball hawk. And I think that if he can just cut down on the number of penalties he has, he'll be pretty good too. So that's, a good start. But at the same time, right now, if the season started, I think their starting free safety would be Charles Godfrey. And he went from being hurt in 2013 to barely playing last year. So that's not an ideal situation. And they've really, I think, been interested in some safeties in free agency. They had reported interest in Ron Parker. Darian Stewart's plane had just touched down in Atlanta when he decided he was going to sign with the Broncos, which is unfortunate. So they have a need there, and I think that the draft is the logical place to go after that. And they've been linked to a few different safeties, so we'll see what they do, but I'm expecting that, to some degree, you're just not going to get considerably better in the secondary this year. The improvement's going to have to come up front, and you feel lucky to have Trufant.
Yeah, I was surprised that Dan didn't make a stronger play for either Max, who ended up being a little bit exorbitantly expensive, or even like a Jaron Johnson, any of the Seahawks.
Yeah, Johnson was never that I heard anyways on the team's radar, and I thought that was interesting too. I don't take that necessarily as an indictment of a player, but it is, I think, a little bit telling when Dan Quinn has coached these guys and he's not willing to spend for them. Maxwell, just because of his price tag, I think he would have liked to have had him in Atlanta, but I doubt you were going to get much of a discount off of what Philly gave him. But Johnson was a guy that I think would have made a lot of sense. So it's interesting that they did involved with that. But I do think they were pretty focused on either Parker or Stewart and sort of missed out on both.
How do you feel about what you've seen so far from Tyson Jackson, former 3rd overall pick? Didn't really make a huge impact in Kansas City, but is sort of playing a different, more inside position as what people had expected. So what do you think so far about Jackson?
He did not have a good year last year, and I think that, depending on who you ask, that's putting it pretty kindly. But Tyson Jackson's a guy, I think we have the track record for him now. He's not a capable interior pass rusher. That's not what he does. But he's been an effective run stopper through most of his career, and I think he'll be that again under Dan Quinn. I think that the knock on Mike Nolan, especially this last year when he appeared to have lost his mind at some points, was that he was not really maximizing the guys he had. And I do think that was true with Tyson Jackson. I think that what I like about Dan Quinn, what I like about what he's saying so far is, we're going to have fast and physical guys, and we're just going to let them play. A simplified scheme, not a lot of smoke and mirrors, just let guys' natural talents shine through. So whether Jackson's, the left defensive end, whether he's playing in the middle, I do think that he'll be effective in the role that he was sort of made to play. Did the Falcons overpay for that? Yes. Yes, they did.
Well, to be fair to Mike Nolan, I think that within the last year, I think perhaps everyone that has ever been involved with the San Francisco 49ers sort of had a bad year. So it's it's sort of like when the head vampire gets killed and all the other vampires die in the whole world. So Mike Nolan, to give him a little break right there. Mina, this is the first time that you've been on the podcast since this new era, I guess, of Seattle Seahawks football. It's called the Jimmy Graham era, I guess.
Oh.
So what are your thoughts on that?
I was laughing because you started the last podcast instead of with the intro, you just had Danny go, Jimmy Graham.
Jimmy Graham.
Like breathlessly.
Yeah, Danny won't live that down. To be fair, I fed him that. I said, yeah, just start talking about Jimmy Graham, and then I said we were gonna ditch the music and do a cold open, and then I know he's caught a little bit of flack just for Jimmy Graham. But why don't you give your best Danny impression and say Jimmy Graham, and then tell us what you think.
Jimmy Graham. To me. Look, I love the trade. Obviously, I was incredibly excited, which is ironic because the only time we've played him was arguably his worst game in the NFL. Was that?
It was both times. They played him at the end of the regular season that year, and then in the playoffs that year, and they shut him down both times.
I was at the playoff game. It was raining. It was horrible. That was the infamous Bruce Irvin confrontation. It was the playoffs, right? Yeah, I was there. Anyways, yeah, he was horrible both times. Which Sean Fahey tweeted about this. I thought it was like a fact. He was like, it's interesting that I think I'm saying his name right. Sean, it's C-I-A-N. Just like a weird European spelling. Anyways,
I have no idea how you say it.
It's like Irish. But he was like, it's interesting that you've seen a lot of teams go after players who have played them well, right? Like the Eagles, Maxwell was amazing against them last year. So for us to go after Graham, who's only been actually less than stellar against us, was kind of interesting and a little counterintuitive and inspiring. But he's exactly what we needed in a lot of ways. Obviously, red zone target. Obviously, touchdowns. Obviously, the height. Russell Wilson can throw it up now. I feel like psychically put a real bandage on the Super Bowl just because he actually addressed how it ended. It was like, oh, okay, this horrible, horrible thing happened. Here's the anecdote so that we'll never experience that again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I would have loved to have Jimmy Graham on that play. Dave, you've seen Jimmy Graham play a lot. I didn't actually look up his numbers against the Falcons. Maybe he's not that good against the Falcons. Maybe he destroys you. What are your thoughts on Jimmy Graham?
He's had both kinds of games against us, but let me say I'm extremely grateful that he's A, out of the division, and B, on an entirely different team that Falcons fans don't think about, because the running gag for the better part of the last 2 years has been, when are we trading for Jimmy Graham? And people ask me this on a regular basis, and I don't know why. So that's over with. I'm glad that's over with. But Jimmy Graham is a player.
Well, don't forget, we have a pipeline straight to your team right now. So
that is true. So maybe we are going to trade for Jimmy Graham. I don't know.
Yeah.
But Jimmy Graham is a great player. Jimmy Graham is a phenomenal receiver. He's very, very difficult to contain. The downside with Jimmy Graham is the sort of stuff that gets thrown at him a lot and kind of sticks, is that, not that he's a soft player, but he can disappear in games, and he's done it against the Falcons. I watched him do it against the Seahawks, and you can take Jimmy Graham out of a game in a way that's very difficult to take somebody like Tony Gonzalez back when he was playing, or Rob Gronkowski out of the game. Jimmy Graham is not a player who will fight through garbage to make a catch, etc. You know, he's a phenomenally talented player. He's going to be tremendous for you guys. Maybe he just changes that reputation around entirely. But this is a guy who has the toolkit to take over a game. I think there's no doubt about it. He's fast, he's big, he's strong, he's got great hands. But when they really needed him to do that, it was 50-50 whether he was actually going to do that. And I think, I hate to get into the anecdotal stuff like that, but, you know, watching him over the years, it's been true that Jimmy Graham is a guy that is just not going to take over games in the way that you would expect him to.
I would love to see the stats, and maybe you can tell me from the Atlanta-New Orleans games, the games in which he was underwhelming, maybe caught for less than 50 yards, disappeared. You know, how did the Saints do overall? Did they lose when he disappeared from the game, or was it more just that kind of gravitational pull, or maybe they still, you know, Drew Brees is able to spread it around, or do you think when he disappears from a game, the entire team suffers?
I don't think that's usually true. I've seen both of those kind of games. Obviously, the Saints were unfortunately kind of owning the Falcons for years there. They were certainly very successful against Mike Smith's Falcons until this last year. So I did see games where they effectively took Jimmy Graham out of it and still lost. At the same time, I did see the flip side of the coin where, you know, Jimmy Graham can't get going, no one else is really getting going, and that hurts you. But I really think that he is one of those guys, because of his talent and because you have to account for him, that he does, you know, drain some attention away from other targets as long as you've got them. The trick is there are those games where you can put a linebacker or a safety on him and just kind of take him out of the game. So it's really, I think the thing with Jimmy Graham is he's more inconsistent than you would expect a player of his caliber to be. But I think he'll be a tremendous upgrade for you guys. You guys have the strong ground attack that New Orleans only had off and on. And I think that'll help take some attention off him too.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because there were a couple games, you know, especially in this era of fantasy football where people get so pissed off at players if they aren't injured in a game, and then they come in and they play, and they only have one catch or something, no catches, and they're like, Jimmy Graham sucks now, blah, 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 and it's one game. There was a game against the Steelers last year where he didn't even have a single target. But I did see a write-up of like, well, look, the Steelers have X amount of players in the area on him in this one, and well, Drew Brees threw 5 touchdowns in that game. The Saints weren't hurting for lack of Jimmy Graham. But at the same time, I think they also won a lot more games when he scored as opposed to when they didn't, just like most players who score a lot. So
also,
yes.
now so more fantasy people are going to start paying attention to the Seahawks. I just realized.
Yeah, they're their first, outside of Marshawn Lynch, I guess, really their first fantasy player that's going to be, you know, a good draft pick, I suppose. But it'll be interesting because they still don't have, I think, that big receiver threat, and it'll see where they go from there. What do you think in terms of the other big news this week? Chris Borland retired. He was 24 years old. He won a few awards last year as a rookie, defensive rookie of the month. That might have just been for the NFC or the whole NFL. Defensive rookie of the week, and I believe at one point NFC defensive player of the week. So of any level, he had 100 and some tackles, and even though he didn't come in until week 7 after he took over for Patrick Willis, who ironically retired as well. That was the last game that Patrick Willis played until he was taken over by Chris Borland, who also retired. As we were saying, the 49ers have not had good luck, and I believe another linebacker just tore his ACL today in a workout.
Who was it?
I can't say. I just seen that news before we started the podcast, and now I can't remember. Yeah, Chase Thomas. So, you know, not Navarro Bowman, not Alden Smith, but not something that they could necessarily stand. So, Dave, what are your thoughts just in terms of these early retirements? And that includes Jake Locker, 26 years old, Jason Worlds, 27 years old. Do you think that any of this sort of stuff, especially with Chris Borland retiring, citing that he doesn't want to get concussions, that he doesn't want to have a shitty life after he retires, where he can't remember where his keys are or where he's at in his 40s. Do you think that this has made a dent or a change at all in the NFL?
You know, I think it's, not to use a cliche, but I think it's almost a chicken and egg thing. I think that, you know, whether he's the one making that dent or that's already kind of happened, and that's what made it possible for Chris Borland to walk away. You know, I think that there's something to the idea that, you know, maybe parents aren't letting their kids play football as much. And that's going to be something that's going to take, you know, 10, 15, 20 years for us to really see in the sport. But I do think that, you know, players are aware of the risks of playing football in a way that they weren't before. And even if, you know, they might have known peripherally about some of this stuff, it wasn't staring them in the face at all times. You know, it's like, you'll hear a player talk and say, you know, every time I forget where my keys are, I freak out a little bit. And that's something that these players are living with. And I think, sure, you know, Chris Borland, you know, he deserves to have that taken as his own personal decision, but that doesn't mean that we can kind of put our heads in the sand and say, well, no one else is ever going to do this again. Chris Borland is this rare person, and football is just going to keep chugging the way it is. I think that, you know, there's a very real possibility that the game either has to change or the talent base is going to change it on its own.
Yeah, it's and I think what I had written in Rolling Stone this week, again, guys, field goals, Rolling Stone. Come on, read up. But what I'd written in Rolling Stone this week was, it's really, I think what shocked people was not the head injuries, was not the age, it was the money. This is a guy that, even though he's made, you know, even if they took away 3/4 of his signing bonus, he still made $500,000 pre-taxes, whatever. But he was walking away from an immediate $500,000. He's leaving a lot of money on the table, and people can't wrap their heads around the fact that a guy who is going to go on to sign a 30, 40, maybe more $1 million contract in a couple of years didn't want that, because he just wants to live a normal life where he can live to be 80 and not have dementia when he's 50. Mina, do you think that it's insane for him to walk away?
No, I mean, of course not. It's his decision, right? And but I think you talking about the money is a good point, because, you know, from what I understand, Chris Borland comes from a pretty solid middle class, at least, background. I think his father went to Wisconsin as well, and so when we talk about what the long-term effects of this are, what does this mean, and there's, you know, been the doesn't mean anything pieces. I think the first thing we'll see is more kids from middle class and up backgrounds being more hesitant to play. I don't expect to see many players walking away from contracts like this early. I think it's more likely that players will walk away after their first big contract. You know, maybe not go for that second contract.
Yeah, I mean,
but
it's interesting.
These are things that are going to take a really long time to trickle through the system. You know what I mean? I mean, we're talking about generations.
Right.
So, I don't know. I don't see fly coming up.
You know, because Chris Borland, he's not walking into the exception. He's walking away from the exception. Like Chris Borland, we're fascinated by the fact that he's becoming one of us. That, you know, Chris Borland is going to become, you know, a guy that, I think he's going back to get a sports management degree. He's gonna go get, you know, a regular salary and have a regular life with a regular family, and basically, well, I can look over at Chris Borland and say, yeah, you're like a guy like me or whatever. And we're amazed by that, not because of what he's walking into, but because he's walking away from. And the fact that, you know, these other guys like Locker Worlds and especially Willis made millions of dollars already, so they can basically, like, you know, take a vacation, you know, do whatever they want, take big risks, and, you know, Borland is just going to be a regular guy. I mean, I am fascinated by it, but it's hard to say whether or not it would change anything, because I don't see that many people being that conscious. Do you think that, Dave? Do you think that the head injuries is scarier? Is really scarier than we let on? That we watch the games and we say, "Oh, okay." And even then, it's like when a player is out with a concussion, I think most people's first thought is, "Well, damn it, we don't have him now for the rest of the game." Not, "Oh shit, I think his life." I think that his life expectancy might have gone down.
Yeah, and I think it's something where, we all probably know people who have had a few concussions, and maybe you notice little things, but one of my writers has suffered 5 concussions in his lifetime, and he'll tell you it's miserable. Um, and I think for these players, it really, now that they kind of know what this is, and now they, even if the NFL is going to stonewall as long as they can, and you can hardly blame them given the amount of money that's at stake in their product, but I do think that the average NFL player is going to be choosing constantly between, do I go for more money, or do I take the risk that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, I'm going to be pretty messed up. And I think you guys are absolutely right that these players who haven't gotten their first big contract yet, a lot of them are going to choose the money, and I can hardly blame them for that. But I do think that we may see the retirement age creep up a little bit. There might be players that are walking away a little bit sooner. There might be players who decide partway through a contract even that they're out because they've had 4 concussions and they're starting to notice it. So I do think it's tough for me to say. Obviously, it sounds a little bit doom and gloom maybe to say 10, 20 years from now that the NFL is going to be pretty changed, but in some ways I don't see how players are going to look at this risk and not have it in the back of their mind.
Yeah, I try to take a stance personally of not telling any player when they should or shouldn't play, not putting my opinion. Everybody has their own decisions to make. Bobby Wagner of the Seahawks, he made a tweet along the lines of, no disrespect to anyone else, but I'm going to play this game until I can't anymore. Mina, do you think that that's sort of a scary mindset for anyone to have, that I'm going to risk my life for sport?
Yeah, or is it scary for us to, know that? I mean, we've been talking about kind of the supply side of this, which is, well, people still want to play football, but thinking through the demand side, which is that, do stories like Chris Borland make fans less likely to watch? Why not? Are we monsters, right? Hearing these things, hearing that a guy's walking away. And I think, there are so many situations where violence is so abhorrent to people that they do walk away and they won't consume it. In this case, there's many reasons why fans won't walk away, one of which is that players like Bobby Wagner are making a choice to play. It's not being inflicted upon other people, and now more than ever, they have the knowledge of what that entails, which in a weird way actually makes it less morally objectionable than 20 years ago when they had no idea.
Yeah, I mean, and the more, I guess, stuff that comes out, and that's the thing, is that the stuff that comes out is popular, so people are going to continue to make it and investigate it, and it's probably just going to get more and more scary as we learn more and more from these players. And the really sad situations, Junior Seau, the ones that that were going to make us really think, but what it's going to take to keep going down a path that changes the game, who knows. So that is the conclusion of this episode. Dave, where can people find you, read you, etc.?
You can find us at www.thefalcoholic.com. On Twitter @thefalcoholic. We're on Facebook /thefalcoholic, and I'm wandering around up in New England somewhere if you happen to bump into me.
What is New England like post Super Bowl?
It's about the same as it was pre-Super Bowl, which is griping about the Red Sox. So nothing really changes.
Those sons of bitches, they don't even feel it. They didn't even love it.
Like the record snow, right? Which I'm 100% confident was God's way of punishing them for.
Yeah, it's been a brutal winter up here, but no, Patriots fans were very, very happy. This is, I think in some ways kind of the potential end of an era for them. So to bookend it with a Super Bowl, I think made a lot of people happy. But you never stay focused on one sport for very long up here.
True enough. Mina, where can people read you, find you, etc.?
ESPN.com.
The big baller. At Mina Kimes. Kimes, correct?
You got it.
What is a name like Kimes? Where does that originate from?
It's originally German. Keim.
Ah, Keim, the German. I'm familiar. My own self. And you can find me at Kenneth Arthur S. On Field Gulls and elsewhere. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Dave and Mina, for joining and letting this podcast live another week. Bye, everyone.